As a professor, one of my jobs is to teach students how to read, but it's a visual kind of reading. So I want to try to do the same with you, using this wonderful triptych, the most famous of Bosch's works in maybe of all of them, but certainly in the Prado, and then talk a little more specifically about a more complicated and perhaps less central work of his, the tabletop, which has many of the same subjects that come back again. When we read words, at least in Europe and other parts of the world that use the kind of standard Roman printing method, we read from left to right, and we read from top to bottom usually as well. So it makes a certain amount of sense to think of this particular triptych as something that you read from a left position, which, at least in this case, we know historically is the beginning of the story, across the panel to hell, which in some respects is the inevitable end of those things that are happening in the center. Now, because I'm a professor, I've taught this picture over a number of years, and it's fascinating to see how the way we respond to the center panel has changed with time. When I first started teaching, it was the grand era of Playboy, followed by the era of all kinds of experimental sexual freedom in the 1960s. And this wound up being the most popular poster in the dormitory rooms of many of the students at my universities. They thought it was a beautiful image of free love, with consequences, of course, on the right wing, but what they saw was the center as the important part from that point of view. Then came the AIDS crisis, and the idea of unprotected sex and free sex became a great deal more dangerous and stigmatized, so that suddenly people began to see the relationship of the hell panel to the center panel as perhaps more significant. So that's an aspect of looking at Bosch, whether you look at the religious triptychs or whether you look at these triptychs, which we know were made for a very aristocratic and wealthy client, a duke who lived in Brussels but had his central territories just north of there. That's an extraordinary important thing to know too about the audience for this picture and its kind of privileged access rather than public church access. I'd like to spend a little bit of time also though talking about the Prado tabletop, the 7 deadly sins and the 4 last things. If we think about it, those numbers already tell us that we're still dealing with the kind of systematic organization of thought that the Middle Ages tended to produce. In addition to the 7 deadly sins, there are, of course, the 7 virtues. 7 is a magical number because of the days of the week and what at the time were believed to be the 7 planets. It is not like these triptychs. It is, in fact, an almost square panel of wood, a different kind of wood than Bosch used in all his other pictures. It's on poplar, which may also reinforce the idea that we have that it might have been used as a tabletop. It has an extraordinary circular structure, which is not completely symmetrical in the round. That is to say, it has an axis which is defined by its center, a center which has a beautiful solar disk, which is a kind of image of the divine in many cultures, and certainly an aspect of Christian beliefs about the Godhead. But it also, if you look at it as a circle with the sun in the center, and in the center of that a kind of opening, it looks like an eyeball. And in the very opening, which we would call the pupil of the eye, is a figure not just of Christ the Creator, but it's of the suffering Christ. And underneath is an inscription that says, "Beware, beware, God sees." God is watching. And from that circular structure come the radiating segments which actually act out the 7 deadly sins. And that's a really important aspect of Bosch that links that picture to this one, where the idea of luxury, defined as desire in the broadest sense, but also usually lustfulness and a kind of indulgence of all the senses, is something that's being played out here with the giant fruits, with the fertility of the world in general, and of course with the erotic aspects. That's the luxuria part of those 7 deadly sins, and we can follow gluttony as overeating, and sloth as lack of activity, and envy as coveting your neighbor's possessions, and so forth, all the way around. One of the great contributions that Bosch made to the history of art was to take the idea of sinfulness as an ethical problem in daily life and make it the subject of painting. No longer was painting devoted to the portraits of the rich and powerful, or to the religious subjects that were connected to the church rituals of the Mass, but now the issue of the relationship of human behavior to divine judgment and the threat of hell is something that plays out in the tabletop as well. Around the corners of the square of the 7 Deadly Sins tabletop are what are called the 4 last things, starting with death, where on his deathbed a man's soul is contested between an angel and a demon, followed by the last judgment, where all are going to be judged by the return of Christ as the judging figure, and then the juxtaposition of heaven and hell. And in that particular picture, which again may be only from the workshop of Bosch, we see a much more explicit and much more pedagogical teaching kind of image, which shows each of the sins with its own distinct label, so that if you have the sin of luxuria and sleep with the wrong people, you'll wind up in hell sleeping with demons and so forth. Each of the sins has its own excess which is marked and its own punishment which is expressly tailored to the sin in question. This is a much richer hell with much more complication, much of it connected, though, to the indulgence in such pleasures as music, for example, or even the gaining of money and titles and wealth and other things that would have been relevant to a princely aristocratic clientele that would have had the viewing of this picture in private. So that's a little bit about Bosch structures and how to read this work, as well as to read the 7 Deadly Sins and the 4 last things.